Jody Bordeaux was a 28-year-old pregnant woman whose life was cut tragically short. When she accepted what seemed to be a routine job, little did she know that she was entering into a high-stakes situation that would rapidly spiral out of control. She and her husband, Sean Bordeaux, had married in 1995 and settled into a small farmhouse on the Kickapoo Indian Reservation in Powhatan, Kansas. Sean was Lakota Sioux, while Jody herself was not Native American. The couple moved to Kansas for an opportunity to help manage the new Golden Eagle Casino. This casino was the first Native-owned casino in the area and promised to bring millions in revenue and jobs to the local Kickapoo tribe. By 1997, Jody's life seemed to be falling into place. She had a loving marriage, a promising career, and after several miscarriages, she was finally pregnant with her first child. At work, Jody's dedication had earned her a promotion to slot machine department staff supervisor, a role that put her in charge of overseeing casino employees. Colleagues described Jody as hardworking and capable, someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Part of her job was to evaluate employee performance and report misconduct or poor performance to the Kickapoo Tribal Council, which had final say in disciplinary actions. Sean, who worked alongside her, was proud of Jody's accomplishments. However, not everyone was happy about Jody's rapid rise through the ranks. Many staff members resented that two outsiders, Sean from another tribe and Jody from no tribe at all, held high positions at the casino. As contemporary reports put it, having outsiders holding significant sway over the operation rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Essentially, they were seen as complete outsiders who had no issue reporting any supposed discrepancies in the casino to the tribal council. Still, in late 1997, Jody remained optimistic. She was excelling in her career and eagerly awaiting the birth of her daughter, whom she planned to name Jordan Shea. Despite Jody's positive outlook, trouble was brewing at work. One of the employees she supervised became a major source of conflict. This particular staffer frequently showed up late, had a poor attitude, and openly disliked answering to Jody. Fulfilling her duties, Jody documented the issues and reported him. The tribal casino board responded by reprimanding the employee and putting him on probation for his behavior. Rather than improve, the employee's conduct worsened until he was eventually fired from the casino. That dismissal didn't end the bad blood. In fact, it seemed to inflame it. A few weeks after being let go, the disgruntled ex-employee filed a formal grievance against Jody, accusing her of habitual tardiness on the job. The accusation had some truth to it. Around that time, Jody had indeed been late to work on several mornings. The reason, however, was not negligence or laziness, but rather, she was undergoing medical treatments related to her pregnancy. Jody always made up the time by staying late on those days, and her husband backed up her explanation. Unfortunately, the nuance didn't matter. In what Jody's husband felt was an act of vengeance, the tribal council took the grievance at face value and fired Jody from her supervisor position. It was a shocking blow. Within a short span, Jody went from a rising star at the casino to unemployed, all while well into her pregnancy. Jody did not accept her firing quietly, and for the next month she fought to regain her job, petitioning the tribal council to review her case. By mid-November 1997, there were encouraging signs that she might win reinstatement. During one council meeting, members indicated they would consider giving Jody her position back. Word spread around the reservation that Jody Bordeaux might soon return to the casino in a supervisory role. This is a rumor that, in hindsight, may have been deadly. Almost as soon as talk of her comeback began, the Bordeaux household started receiving a string of disturbing anonymous phone calls. The calls were frequent and unnerving, and when Jody answered, the person on the other end would remain silent or abruptly hang up. She confided in her mother, Candace Smith, about these strange calls, sensing that she was being harassed by someone who wanted to frighten her. Jody also had the creeping feeling that someone was watching their home. On several nights, she told Sean she heard noises outside and saw furtive movements in the yard. Sean tried to reassure his wife that it was probably just a raccoon or a coyote lurking in the dark, never imagining it could be something far more sinister. Late on the night of November 20th, 1997, those vague threats became a brutal reality. It was past midnight, into the early moments of November 21st, when Sean and Jody Bordeaux were relaxing in their house after a quiet evening. Jody was already in her pajamas, and the couple's dog suddenly began barking at something outside. The couple paused and ended up going on full alert. It was after 12:30 a.m. and pitch dark on their rural property. Sean got up to see what the dog was fussing about and headed toward the back porch door. In that instant, without warning, a storm of steel began to hail down upon the building. This series of deafening pops and flashes tore through the Bordeaux home. Bullets blasted through the living room window and walls, spraying drywall dust and debris into the air. At first, Sean didn't comprehend what was happening. The first loud pop made him think a light bulb had exploded in the lamp behind his chair. But in the next second, as more shots rang out, Sean realized their house was under attack. He shouted for Jody, and Jody had jumped up from the couch when the shooting began and ran toward the bedroom for cover. Before she could shut the door or escape the line of fire, one of the high-powered rifle rounds ripped through the wall and struck Jody in the head. She collapsed to the floor of the bedroom. In the chaos of the moment, Sean dropped to the ground and crawled after his wife. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm of steel ceased. Shakily, Sean made his way to Jody's side and found her lying on the bedroom floor, bleeding and unresponsive. One glance told him the terrible truth. His wife had been slain instantly by the shot to her head. Sean's next thought was of their unborn baby. Jody was 7 months pregnant, and he desperately hoped the child might still be saved. He grabbed the telephone and dialed 911, frantically urging for an ambulance. Within minutes, deputies and EMTs arrived at the remote farmhouse. Sean was distraught, but pointed officers to where his wife lay gravely wounded. Paramedics rushed Jody to a local hospital in a last attempt to save the baby she was carrying, but tragically, it was too late, and neither mother nor child could be saved. The joyful future that had awaited this young family just hours before had been shattered in a hail of bullets. Investigators surveyed a chilling crime scene at the Bordeaux home. Outside in the yard, they found numerous spent shell casings strewn near the house, evidence that the shooter had fired many rounds from just outside the Bordeaux's windows. In the light of police flashlights, multiple bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and shattered glass littered the living room. It appeared the perpetrator had quietly approached the house in the dark, opened fire on the home from outside, and then fled into the night. Sean told officers that after the hail of bullets stopped, he had heard the sound of a vehicle speeding away into the darkness. The attack had the hallmarks of an ambush designed to inflict maximal carnage. There was no sign of burglary or an attempt to enter the house, and the shooter's intent was plainly not robbery. This horrible act against Jody Bordeaux, a young pregnant wife slain on reservation land, posed immediate jurisdictional questions. The attack took place at the Bordeaux's home, which was near the boundary of the Kickapoo Reservation. Sean, in his shock and grief, urged that the FBI get involved, believing a crime on native land would fall under federal jurisdiction. The tribe considered the farmhouse part of the reservation, but due to shifting boundary lines, it was technically just outside tribal land. In the end, federal authorities declined to take the lead, citing jurisdictional limitations, and the case was left in the hands of state and local law enforcement. The Brown County Sheriff's Department was first on the scene, and they promptly called in the Kansas Bureau of Investigation for assistance that same night. Detectives and crime scene analysts combed through the house for evidence, but the nature of the attack left them few clues to go on. The shooter had fired from a distance under cover of darkness, leaving behind only shell casings and footprints that yielded little useful forensic evidence. No weaponry was recovered at or near the scene. From the outset, investigators looked closely at Sean Bordeaux, as is standard procedure when a spouse is slain, but his account held up under scrutiny. Sean's 911 call, his attempts to save Jody, and the lack of any motive on his part led police to rule him out as a suspect early on. And yeah, let's just be honest here. If he was involved, the absolute last thing he would have done is asked for the FBI to get involved. Attention quickly turned toward the casino workplace as the likely nexus of the crime. Jody's recent troubles at the Golden Eagle Casino were well known, and detectives learned about the fired employee who had openly threatened her career. The fact that Jody had been receiving anonymous harassing calls in the weeks before her death was a significant red flag. It suggested this wasn't a random act, such as an attempted robbery gone horrifically wrong, but a targeted hit stemming from an ongoing grudge. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that solving this case would not be easy. Brown County authorities and the KBI interviewed dozens of people, casino staff, local residents, and members of the Kickapoo community, in hopes of finding a witness or informant. But fear and silence pervaded the community. Investigators grew frustrated at the lack of cooperation. According to those familiar with the case, there was long-standing mistrust between the local Native American community and outside law enforcement, which hindered communication. Potential witnesses who might have seen or heard something that night were reluctant to come forward. Some were possibly intimidated by threats. Indeed, several individuals declined to be interviewed for a televised segment about Jody's case after they reportedly received warnings to stay quiet. Authorities feared that people with knowledge of the crime were keeping silent out of loyalty or fear of retribution within the small community. By 2000, nearly 3 years had passed with no arrests. Frustrated by the slow progress, Brown County Attorney Kevin Hill convened an inquest to compel testimony and shake loose new information. Hill said, in reference to the inquiry, that investigators had zeroed in on a few likely perpetrators, but only gave limited details beyond that. These individuals, he noted, were not strangers to Jody, but rather people who had an axe to grind. In other words, the prime suspects were people connected to Jody's work life, exactly what Sean and others had suspected from the beginning. Despite increasing confidence about the who and why behind the act, the proof remained elusive. Investigators simply could not gather enough admissible evidence to file charges. Important witnesses stayed silent, and forensic evidence was scant. By the late 2000s, authorities had privately identified 3 individuals they considered the chief suspects in the act. But without witness cooperation or direct evidence, law enforcement couldn't make a viable case. More than 25 years have now passed since Jody Bordeaux's slaying, and official theories about the case have remained consistent. Investigators are convinced that the motive was retaliation related to Jody's job at the casino. The primary person of interest has long been the former Golden Eagle employee whom Jody disciplined and ultimately helped fire. It's widely believed by law enforcement that this ex-employee didn't act alone. The theory is that he enlisted 1 or 2 accomplices, perhaps friends or family members, to carry out or assist in the assault on the Bordeaux homestead. The crime may have involved a driver and a shooter, or multiple shooters, given the number of shots fired. Notably, the authorities likely know the exact amount of shooters involved, but of course the fact that the investigation is ongoing complicates the release of this information. Investigators have never publicly named these suspects, but they have indicated that all of them were familiar with Jody and had personal beef with her stemming from the workplace. Some who are close to the case feel that the identity of the perpetrator is practically an open secret in the community. They suspect that many locals know or strongly suspect who pulled the trigger, but have stayed silent to protect themselves or their families. Ultimately, even if someone from the community did want to come forward to put those responsible behind bars, this would likely require testifying in court. It's unfortunate that the farmhouse wasn't on reservation property and that the FBI wasn't able to get involved. If the FBI had been involved, they would have had the resources to protect witnesses in a federal case. Local law enforcement simply doesn't have the sort of resources that would be required to guarantee the safety of witnesses in a case such as this. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you guys to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. Also, remember to hit like and subscribe. And also remember to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Woolly mammoths once roamed across the Ice Age tundra of Europe, Asia, and North America, towering over the prehistoric landscape with their curved tusks and shaggy coats. By around 10,000 years ago, however, these giant herbivores had mostly vanished from the mainland. The world was warming at the end of the last ice age, shrinking the mammoths' favored cold grassland habitat, and human hunters were spreading into their territories. One by one, mammoth populations fell to a combination of climate change and hunting pressure. Yet, against all odds, a tiny population of mammoths found refuge on a remote Arctic island. On Wrangel Island, a small island north of Siberia, mammoths survived for another 6,000 years after their mainland cousins had died out. Incredibly, this means the last Wrangel Island mammoths were still alive around 2000 BC. To put this in perspective, this means these great creatures were walking the earth well after the construction of the Great Pyramids at Giza. In the aftermath of the Ice Age, as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, Wrangel Island was cut off from the mainland. A small herd of mammoths became marooned on this island around 10,000 years ago, when rising seas turned a once-connected coastal plain into an isolated sanctuary. Scientists estimate that perhaps no more than 8 to 10 mammoths initially made up this stranded group. Such a tiny founding population faced a serious genetic bottleneck, but they managed to survive and reproduce. And trust me, the less you think about how these elephant cousins managed to pull this off, the better. Remarkably, within a few hundred years, the Wrangel Island mammoths rebounded from their narrow escape. Their numbers grew to a stable population of about 200 to 300 animals, a sizable herd given the island's limited size. For millennia, these mammoths lived and bred in isolation, wandering the tundra valleys of Wrangel and drinking from its rivers under the northern sky. Free from human interference and predators like large carnivores, they carved out a niche on the island. Their physical size remained similar to mainland woolly mammoths. While they were initially believed to be separate species of dwarf mammoth, subsequent findings indicated a large variation in the size of the animals. This Arctic island enclave became the last stronghold of a species that had otherwise nearly disappeared from the planet. Even as thousands of years passed, the Wrangel Island mammoths continued to persist in their seclusion. They survived long beyond the extinction of mammoths elsewhere, enduring harsh Arctic winters and finding enough sparse vegetation in summer to sustain themselves. For roughly 6,000 years after mammoths vanished from the continents, the island population stayed viable. To put that in perspective, the Wrangel mammoths outlived the Ice Age by many millennia. They were still drinking from Wrangel Island's riverbeds, while the Great Pyramids were being built in Egypt, and stories of Gilgamesh were first being told in Mesopotamia. This extended survival has fascinated scientists and the public alike. How did this small group manage to thrive for so long? And ultimately, what finally caused their demise around 4,000 years ago when their island had kept them safe for so many generations? Around 4,000 years ago, the mammoths of Wrangel Island abruptly disappeared from the fossil record. Their extinction has prompted much scientific detective work, and several leading theories have emerged to explain why these last mammoths died out. In piecing together this prehistoric mystery, researchers have considered factors that affected mammoths elsewhere. One obvious suspect in the mammoths' extinction is climate and habitat change. The world these mammoths inhabited was not static. During the mid-Holocene, the epoch 4,000 to 10,000 years ago, climates continued to warm and environments changed. On the mainland, warming temperatures had transformed the open steppe tundra ecosystem, where mammoths flourished, into boggier tundra and boreal forest. This change led to an environment which supported few of the grasses and herbs the mammoths ate. As the climate gradually warmed, the island might have seen alterations in its plant communities or shorter periods of sea ice that could affect the ecology. However, the key point is that Wrangel's mammoths survived those long-term changes for thousands of years. There's no sign of a slow decline in their population that would indicate they simply dwindled away as their food supply ran out. In fact, genetic studies suggest the population remained stable up until the end. That makes a slow, climate-driven fade-out seem unlikely as the sole cause of extinction. Instead, if climate played a role, it may have been through a more abrupt environmental event. Scientists speculate that an extreme weather episode could have struck the island near the end of the mammoth's tenancy on Wrangel. For example, an unusually severe winter storm or an icy rain-on-snow event might have suddenly locked up the vegetation under ice, leading to mass starvation in a single season. Such climatic disasters are rare, but they can wipe out large numbers of animals very quickly. Elsewhere in the world, human predation is often listed as a prime driver of megafauna extinctions. Stone Age hunters targeted mammoths for meat, skins, and ivory, and archaeological sites across Eurasia and the Americas. On Wrangel Island, however, the scenario appears very different. The isolation that protected the mammoths from outside threats also kept early humans away from Wrangel for a long time. Archaeological evidence indicates that humans didn't reach Wrangel Island until roughly 3,700 years ago, a few centuries after the last mammoth had already died. Moreover, no butchered mammoth remains have been found on Wrangel from before that time. This strongly suggests that unlike their counterparts on the mainland, the Wrangel mammoths were never hunted by humans. Scientists therefore largely rule out overhunting as a cause of the Wrangel Island extinction. Perhaps the most intriguing theory has to do with genetics. When a population is as small and isolated as the Wrangel group, inbreeding is unavoidable. Over generations, inbreeding can lead to an accumulation of harmful genetic mutations, a process sometimes called genomic meltdown. In 2017, researchers sequenced the DNA from a Wrangel Island mammoth and found signs that the population's genetic health had indeed suffered by the end. The Wrangel mammoth's genome contained a number of detrimental mutations and missing genes. Many of the mammoth's olfactory receptor genes, important for smell, were non-functional, and genes related to social signaling via scent were damaged. One gene affecting hair texture was broken, which might even have given the last mammoths unusually silky coats. The idea was that by 4,000 years ago, the mammoth's fertility had been compromised by inbreeding and mutation accumulation, dooming the herd. However, newer research has complicated this picture, which had previously been widely accepted. In 2024, a team of scientists analyzed genomes from 21 different mammoths, including many from Wrangel Island, spanning its thousands of years of habitation. What they found was surprising. Despite the expected inbreeding and reduced genetic diversity, the Wrangel population seemed demographically healthy for most of its time on the island. The genetic diversity of the island mammoths did drop sharply when the group was first isolated. But after that initial bottleneck, the population expanded and maintained a roughly steady size of a few hundred individuals for millennia. Importantly, the study detected that the most harmful mutations had been purged by natural selection, even as some milder mutations accumulated. In other words, genetics alone didn't seal their fate. The Wrangel mammoths were inbred, yes, but they had managed to overcome that hurdle and were likely not on an inevitable genetic death spiral. This means that while genetic deterioration might have made the population more vulnerable or less resilient, it likely wasn't the primary cause of extinction. Another practical factor to consider is the availability of fresh water. Large mammals need a lot of drinking water, and on small islands, droughts or changes in water sources can be catastrophic. A dramatic example of this comes from St. Paul Island, in what is now Alaska's Bering Sea. St. Paul was another island where mammoths hung on after the Ice Age, though not as long as on Wrangel. The St. Paul mammoths died out about 5,600 years ago, and scientists have found evidence that a drought caused their only lake to dry up. In essence, those mammoths, surrounded by an endless body of water, died of thirst when fresh water became scarce. This finding raises the question, could something similar have happened on Wrangel Island? Wrangel is much larger than St. Paul, and likely had multiple streams or tundra ponds fed by snowmelt. At present, the idea is just a hypothesis, but it's possible it may have been a contributing factor. With human hunting and gradual climate or genetic decline looking less likely, many scientists now suspect that a sudden catastrophic event delivered the final blow to Wrangel's mammoths. The genetic study published in 2024 concluded that the population was stable right up until the end, implying that something happened quickly to wipe them out. What could strike an entire herd of hundreds of animals so abruptly? Two possibilities stand out: disease or extreme weather. If a new infectious disease arrived, perhaps carried by birds, it could have swept through a population with low immune diversity. In fact, researchers noted that the Wrangel mammoths had unusually low variation in genes related to immune response. This could mean they were especially vulnerable to a virulent pathogen, having fewer genetic tools to fight off a plague. A sudden epidemic, even one that might only cause mild illness in a more diverse population, might have raced through the herd unchecked, leading to a mass die-off in a short time. Unfortunately, diseases leave little trace in the fossil record, so this theory is hard to prove or disprove directly. The other possibility is an extreme weather disaster, as mentioned earlier, something like an unprecedented blizzard, ice storm, or a summer failure of plant growth. For instance, a once-in-10,000-year winter storm could have covered the island in ice or snow, deep enough that mammoths couldn't find any food. It's important to note that these theories aren't mutually exclusive. In reality, the extinction of the Wrangel Island mammoths may have been the result of several factors combining to push the animals past a tipping point. Perhaps the climate had gradually made life harder, weakening the herd's overall health. The limited genetic diversity might have reduced their ability to adapt or fight off illness. Then, finally, an acute disaster like a disease outbreak or severe weather event struck a population that, while stable on the surface, didn't have much resilience to spare. In the end, what is clear is that the mammoths disappeared relatively suddenly, not long after 4,000 years ago, so any ultimate cause had to operate on a short time scale. On June 16, 1987, A horrific scene unfolded in a Toledo, Ohio neighborhood just off Interstate 75. In the early morning hours, a passing driver spotted flames in an alley behind a closed auto repair shop. Investigating further, he came upon a burning body. The victim was a young woman who had been wrapped in a blanket with a blue plastic bag over her head and deliberately set on fire. Firefighters were called to extinguish her smoldering remains. The woman had no identification on her, and any distinguishing features were partially obscured by the flames. Authorities determined that the victim had likely died a day or two before her body was dumped and burned. The location, an alley near Collingwood Boulevard and I-75 in Lucas County, suggested that someone had gone to great lengths to hide the body. From the beginning, investigators treated the case as a probable slaying or cover-up, given the extreme measures taken to destroy evidence. In the aftermath of the discovery, detectives with the Toledo Police and the Lucas County Coroner's Office gathered what details they could about the Jane Doe. Despite the damage from the fire, an autopsy and crime scene examination yielded several clues about the victim. She was a white female, estimated to be in her late teens or early 20s, and she stood approximately 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing around 110 pounds. She had short hair described as strawberry blonde or light brown. Not much clothing survived the fire, but investigators noted she was wearing Jordache brand jeans, a popular brand of the 1980s. She also had 5 small, round pearl stud earrings in each ear, and her toenails were painted pink. These personal details suggested she took care in her appearance, at least to some degree. The coroner observed significant tooth decay, implying she had received little or poor dental care in life. This detail hinted at socioeconomic factors or lifestyle choices. However, it was unclear whether this decay was the result of recent dental neglect, the result of recent substance use, or the result of a lifetime of minimal dental intervention. Investigators also compared her case against numerous missing person reports. They even considered missing teens from other cities, including the Cleveland area, suspecting she might have traveled or been brought from elsewhere. To enlist the public's help, authorities turned to forensic artists. The Michigan State Police assisted by creating a clay facial reconstruction of the Jane Doe's face, attempting to recreate her likeness in life. I've put this clay reconstruction on the screen now for those of you who just listen, and to be honest, I can see why the authorities moved away from using these models. That said, the hope was that someone would recognize the face or the description and come forward with a name. Over the years, several leads trickled in, but none panned out, and the victim's unique details didn't trigger any definitive recognition. By the 1990s and 2000s, the case had gone cold, and in official records, she was often referred to as the Lucas County Jane Doe. Despite periodic reviews of the case, for 37 years the young woman's identity and the story of how she ended up in that alley remained a haunting mystery. From the outset, investigators faced a troubling question. Was this young woman the victim of a crime, or was her death the result of a tragic accident that someone tried to cover up? The autopsy results deepened the intrigue. The Lucas County coroner found no bullet wounds, stab injuries, or blunt force trauma on the remains. Instead, they discovered evidence of a fatal coke overdose, which was determined to be the cause of death. In other words, she likely died from coke before her body was set ablaze. There were no other signs of violence on her body aside from the post-mortem burning. But this immediately led to a follow-up question. If she had simply overdosed, why the gruesome attempt to destroy her remains? This led police to suspect that those who were with her when she died panicked and attempted to hide her identity and the circumstances of her death. It was theorized that she may have overdosed at a different location, possibly in a trap house or at a party. Whoever was responsible for her or present at her death chose to dispose of her body in a remote spot in Toledo, setting it on fire to eliminate the evidence. The burning of the body suggested fear or guilt on the part of the perpetrators, as if they were desperate to ensure she could not be recognized or tied back to them. For decades, the cover-up or slaying question hung over the case. On paper, the coroner had ruled the death an overdose, with the manner of death officially undetermined due to the unusual aftermath. Yet, investigators and the public alike wondered if the overdose might have been forced, or if other foul play was involved. The fire had destroyed so much physical evidence that it was impossible to know if, for example, she had been restrained or assaulted prior to death. Every theory about what happened to this young woman was hampered by the fact that no one knew who she was. Without an identity, police couldn't easily trace her last steps or the people she was associating with at the time. But it turned out that this mystery perhaps wasn't as far out of reach as investigators in the 1980s believed. It turns out that this Jane Doe was none other than Tammy Lowe, and what I'm going to tell you next adds another layer to this nightmare. In fact, it turned out that Tammy Lowe had been reported missing, but due to a clerical or investigative mishap, those reports never made it into national databases. Family members later revealed that Tammy's grandmother tried twice in 1987 to file missing person reports for her in the Detroit area. However, police at the time failed to officially enter her as a missing person. This heartbreaking lapse meant that for all those years, when authorities searched for a missing girl matching the Jane Doe, Tammy's name never appeared. She had unfortunately completely slipped through the cracks of the system, her family's pleas unheard. By the early 2020s, a new tool was changing the landscape of cold case investigations: investigative genetic genealogy. This technique involves analyzing DNA from an unidentified person and comparing it to profiles uploaded in databases in order to find relatives. It had been used to solve several high-profile cold cases, and in 2024, the Toledo Police Department decided it was time to apply this method to the long-standing Jane Doe case. The work was carried out by Othram, a Texas-based forensic laboratory specializing in solving cold cases through this method. Othram's scientists extracted a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains, a challenging task given the damage from the fire and passage of time. Using that DNA profile, they scoured genealogical databases for any relatives of the unknown woman. By early 2025, the DNA search yielded a promising lead: a possible relative living in Michigan. Detectives from Ohio teamed up with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and local authorities in Michigan to investigate this lead. They identified family members of a young woman who had vanished from the Detroit area in 1987, and the pieces were starting to come together rapidly. In February 2025, a close relative provided a DNA sample to compare against the Jane Doe. After a few anxious weeks of waiting, the results arrived. On March 20th, 2025, nearly 38 years after the body was found, the Jane Doe was formally identified as Tammy Dale Lowe, an 18-year-old from Taylor, Michigan. When the news broke, Tammy's family was both relieved and devastated. They had spent decades wondering what happened to the bright teen who disappeared in 1987. Now they had confirmation of her fate, though the details were painful. Tammy Lowe had just graduated high school and turned 18 when she went missing in early June 1987. She had fallen into substance use, and the last time she was seen alive was at a house in Detroit where, according to family accounts, she may have been given substances against her will. Her family reported her missing, but as noted, the case wasn't taken seriously at the time by authorities. With Tammy Lowe's identity confirmed, the investigation shifted focus. Detectives hoped to piece together how she ended up where she did and who was responsible for the gruesome disposal of her body. The circumstances of her death remain an unsolved mystery, despite the identification. What investigators don't know is whether that overdose was accidental or deliberately inflicted, and who was present when she died. Given that Tammy was last seen in Metro Detroit, one theory is that she overdosed there, and that individuals transported her body over the Ohio state line to Toledo to dump her. This would explain why a Michigan teenager's remains showed up in Ohio. However, without witnesses or further evidence, this theory remains unproven. What is clear is that someone took great pains to erase Tammy's identity, wrapping her in a carpet and tarp, covering her face with plastic, and setting her on fire in an isolated spot. Whether their motive was to cover up a crime or simply a panicked attempt to hide a tragic accident, those responsible have never been held accountable. Now that Tammy's name is known, investigators have new avenues to pursue. They can interview her relatives and anyone who knew her back in 1987 to build a timeline of her final days. They can also re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes, armed with the knowledge of who she was and where she came from. Given how recently her case was partially solved, I hope to have an update on Tammy Lowe's story in a future episode. In the middle of a Russian swampland near St. Petersburg stands a rusting radio tower behind an iron gate. This is the supposed headquarters of a mysterious radio station that no authority has ever openly claimed. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, this station broadcasts an incessant, monotonous buzz on the shortwave frequency 4025 kilohertz. Every few seconds, the monotone is joined by a second sound, often likened to a ghostly ship's foghorn, and then the droning buzz continues. Occasionally, the foghorn-like drone stops, and a voice cuts through the static. A man or woman comes on, speaking brief words or numbers in Russian, before the buzz continues. This eerie broadcast has persisted for decades, captivating shortwave listeners around the world. It's known by the codename UVB-76, nicknamed the Buzzer. To this day, its true purpose remains officially unconfirmed, making it one of the most enduring mysteries in radio broadcasting. UVB-76 is widely believed to be a type of numbers station, part of a secretive tradition of radio broadcasting that dates back to the early 20th century. Numbers stations are shortwave radio transmitters that send out coded messages, often in the form of spoken numbers or Morse code. They're believed to be destined for intelligence agents in the field. During the Cold War, such stations became prolific as a high-security, low-risk method for governments to communicate with spies or military units over vast distances. Shortwave signals can travel thousands of miles by bouncing off the ionosphere, which made them ideal for reaching operatives across borders. Crucially, anyone with a shortwave receiver can hear a numbers station, but only those with the secret decryption key, typically a one-time pad, can decipher its true message. This one-way broadcast method is virtually untraceable to the recipient. An agent can receive orders in complete anonymity, since there is no way to prove who is merely listening to a radio signal. Among all known numbers stations, UVB-76, the Buzzer, stands out for its unique and relentless broadcast. Its origins date back to the late Soviet era. The station was first noticed by listeners in the late 1970s, and by 1982, the strange buzzing on 4625 kilohertz had been recorded. Throughout the 1980s, the signal reportedly consisted of short, high-pitched beeps, one every couple of seconds. By the early 1990s, this pattern evolved into the signature buzz that gave the station its nickname. The buzz is a repeating tone that sounds 20 to 30 times per minute, essentially round the clock. The purpose of this incessant noise, according to radio experts, is likely to act as a channel marker, an audible flag that tells other radio users the frequency is occupied and active. In practical terms, the buzzing assures those listening on the channel that the station is functioning. On old analog receivers, the distinctive tone also makes tuning in easier, and if the sound stops unexpectedly, it could trigger alarms on monitoring equipment. In short, the buzz itself may carry no hidden message, but rather it simply keeps the communication line open and ready. What truly deepened the mystery of UVB-76 were the rare moments when the buzzing stopped. From 1987 to 1997, no voice transmissions were documented on the channel. Then, on December 24th, 1997, listeners heard a live voice break the silence. The voice read out a coded message in Russian phonetic alphabet, including the call sign UVB-76, repeated several times. This marked the first time the mysterious station identified itself. After that, years might pass between voice messages, but they did recur unpredictably. A typical message might consist of a short identifier, like a call sign, followed by a sequence of numbers or a list of Russian names and words. One such transmission in 2013, for instance, announced in Russian, Command 135 issued, as part of an encoded military-style message. These messages are spoken in a flat, controlled tone, and are believed by experts to likely be live rather than pre-recorded. To an ordinary listener, they are almost indecipherable as they're just a string of code words and numbers. Yet to whoever is meant to hear it, that single minute of speech amid the endless buzz could convey something of great importance. Over time, UVB-76 has undergone notable changes in both form and apparent location. For more than 3 decades of the Cold War and its aftermath, the station transmitted from a site near Povarovo, a small town about 40 kilometers from Moscow. This was the location of a Soviet-era communications hub, and after the Soviet Union's collapse, the station kept running at this facility under Russian Army oversight. In those years, the station's operations were shrouded in secrecy. However, in 2010, a series of dramatic events pulled the buzzer further into the spotlight. In early June 2010, for the first time in memory, the buzzer stopped transmitting for about 24 hours. A few weeks later, in August 2010, the normally regular signal began to cut in and out, and on August 25th, curious sounds were heard in the background. These noises sounded like people moving furniture or equipment in a room. There were snippets of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake music quietly playing in the background, adding to the atmosphere of the moment. It was as if someone was physically present at the transmission site, tinkering with the equipment while inadvertently broadcasting ambient noises. Then, on September 7th, 2010, at 8:48 p.m. Moscow time, UVB-76 suddenly issued a new voice message. A male voice spoke the code Mikhail Dmitry Genya Boris, which listeners recognized as a new call sign. The message continued with numbers and Russian words, indicating that the station had not only changed its identifier, but possibly its role or location. Indeed, soon after this event, signal triangulation indicated that the buzzer had moved. No longer was it emanating from the Povarovo base. It appeared to be coming from a site near St. Petersburg in northwest Russia. Later, as Russia's military reorganized its command structure, the station likely moved again, though the current whereabouts are unconfirmed. Why does UVB-76 exist at all, and what is the purpose behind this endless broadcast of buzzes and occasional codes? The most prominent theory is that the buzzer is an espionage tool, essentially a classic numbers station transmitting messages to spies. This idea is appealing given the station's mysterious nature and the historical use of shortwave radio by intelligence agencies. Could those rare voice messages be orders to sleeper agents embedded abroad? This is often where the analysis stops, but actually there's much more to the story than this. However, many experts doubt that UVB 76's primary role is spycraft in the traditional sense. Unlike typical number stations that broadcast easily recognizable number groups at scheduled times, the buzzer's messages come at unpredictable intervals. Moreover, analyses suggest its transmitter power is not especially high for long-range global broadcasts. These factors lead some to conclude that this broadcast might not be optimal for covertly reaching agents worldwide. In other words, while espionage cannot be ruled out, UVB 76 doesn't fit the mold of a classic number station in some respects. Another widely supported theory is that UVB 76 serves as a military communications channel for the Russian armed forces in the former Soviet sphere of influence. This may explain why the broadcast is underpowered compared to a traditional number station. Notably, some Baltic officials, who were once an integral part of the Soviet Union, have indicated that this is what they believe it is. That said, no one with direct knowledge of the buzzer has ever come forward, and all the evidence has been secondhand, or worse. Perhaps the most ominous theory, one that has captured public imagination, is that UVB 76 is a component of a dead man's switch in Russia's nuclear defense apparatus. Specifically, some have linked it to the legendary Soviet perimeter system. This system, which was designed during the Cold War, allowed the Soviet Union to automatically retaliate with nuclear missiles if the USSR's leadership were wiped out. According to this hypothesis, the buzzer's tone is effectively a signal that says, "All is well." If it were to fall silent due to a devastating strike, the silence itself would trigger perimeter to launch a counterstrike without human input. It's a particularly chilling idea, since this seemingly innocuous buzz could be the sound of doomsday on hold. However, experts are quick to point out serious flaws in the dead hand speculation. For one, UVB 76 has had numerous unplanned outages and interruptions over the years, which suggests it's not an infallible fail-safe signal. If global nuclear war hung in the balance of the buzzer never skipping a beat, it's unlikely it would be allowed to sputter as often as it historically has. Thus, while the dead hand theory is compelling as a mystery trope, most analysts consider it very unlikely in reality. On April 21, 1918, Manfred von Richthofen, the famed Red Baron of Germany, with a record-breaking 80 aerial victories, took off in his bright red triplane along with several squadron mates. The events of this day would spark a historical debate, which has continued on for more than a century. Over the Somme Valley in France, they engaged a patrol of British Royal Air Force Sopwith camels. During the dogfight, one camel piloted by Lieutenant Wilfred May broke away, and the Baron gave chase at low altitude deep into Allied territory. Roy Brown, a Canadian pilot flying a Sopwith camel, dived steeply from above to help his comrade. At the same time, Allied ground troops in the trenches below also opened fire with their machine guns and rifles as the low-flying red triplane passed over. Amid the bursts of gunfire from both Brown's aircraft and multiple Australian units on the ground, the Red Baron's luck finally ran out. His triplane abruptly descended and crash-landed in a field, ending the aerial ace, just a few days shy of his 26th birthday. The Red Baron had broken one of his own tactical rules by flying low and fast over enemy lines, a risky maneuver that put him within range of ground fire. His death was a significant propaganda coup for the Allies, but almost immediately a debate began. Who fired the bullet that ultimately felled history's most famous fighter ace? Captain Roy Brown of Canada was the pilot who engaged Manfred von Richthofen from the air, and he was officially credited with shooting down the Red Baron in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Brown reported that he dove on the red triplane from behind while it was targeting Lieutenant May, and he fired a long and consistent burst at close range. According to Brown's combat report, the triplane went into a steep dive and crashed after his attack. Lieutenant May later affirmed that he saw Richthoven's plane go down and was completely convinced that Brown must have been the one who hit the Baron. In recognition of Brown's daring interception of Richthoven, a formal RAF Board of Inquiry credited Brown with the victory. This, of course, made him an instant hero as the man who vanquished the Red Baron. Brown's claim went largely unquestioned by the RAF at the time, and he received much public acclaim. In fact, the British had strong motivation to credit an airman. Manfred von Richthofen had long been the most coveted target, and the RAF had even offered rewards and an automatic Victoria Cross to any pilot who could defeat him. Brown himself was modest about the achievement, but officially he went down in history as the victor over the Red Baron. However, from the very start, there were dissenting voices and conflicting eyewitness accounts that suggested Brown might not have fired the shot. Almost as soon as Richthoven's triplane hit the ground, Australian ground troops on the scene asserted that their fire had brought him down, not Roy Brown. Several machine gun posts of the Australian Imperial Force were stationed along Richthoven's flight path near Moreland Court Ridge, and they had engaged the low-flying red triplane. Multiple soldiers claimed credit, but through the years, only one has been found to have any serious claim. This claimant was Sergeant Cedric Popkin, an anti-aircraft Vickers machine gunner of the 24th Machine Gun Company, who fired at the triplane from the ground. Popkin later recounted that he fired 2 bursts at the Red Baron, first as it approached his position, and a second time as it banked and flew away, presenting its side and back to him. It was during this second burst, as von Richthoven began turning away, that Popkin likely scored a hit. In a letter to Australia's official war historian, Popkin described tracking the red plane through a 180-degree turn and firing at it until it rolled and crashed. The angle of Popkin's fire, from the Baron's right side and slightly to the rear, matches well with the wound the Baron sustained. Australian witnesses on the ground noted that the red triplane's flight became erratic after Popkin's bursts, veering and almost stalling before crash landing. They took this as evidence that ground fire had mortally wounded the pilot. Central to unraveling the mystery is the forensic evidence from von Richthoven's wounds and the trajectory of the bullet. Allied medical officers conducted an autopsy on the fallen airman on the day of his death. They found that von Richthofen had been slain by a single bullet, which entered under his right armpit and traveled upward through his chest cavity before exiting near the left side of his chest. Notably, the same sort of ammo was used by all Allied weaponry at play on that day, so the ammo itself doesn't solve the problem. But to get back to the main point, in other words, the shot came from below and to the right of the Baron, coursing upward through his body. This trajectory is a crucial clue. If Captain Roy Brown had struck the Red Baron while diving from above and behind in his Sopwith Camel, the bullet path would be expected to travel downward into von Richthofen, not upward. Brown himself approached from the Baron's rear right at a higher altitude. It's difficult to reconcile Brown's attack angle with the wound's upward track, unless the Baron's plane was steeply banked at the exact moment Brown fired. Brown never mentioned such a steep bank in his combat report or later accounts. In fact, he described von Richthofen looking back at him during the chase, implying the triplane was roughly level. This casts significant doubt on whether Brown's bullets could have caused the wound. Another piece of evidence is the timing of von Richthofen's final actions. If Brown's burst had hit the Baron squarely through the chest, piercing his heart or lungs, von Richthofen would likely have lost consciousness almost instantly. he would have been unable to continue a controlled chase for as long as he did. Medical experts note that a wound through the heart or major vessels would have incapacitated the pilot within 20 seconds at most. This suggests that Brown's fire did not immediately end the Baron, and that the mortal wound was inflicted at the very end of the pursuit. That timeline better fits the accounts of the Australian gunners, who fired on the triplane just before it went into its fatal dive. The ballistic trajectory evidence aligns most neatly with Sergeant Popkin's firing position. Popkin's second burst was aimed at von Richthofen's right side as the triplane was turning away, which means his Vickers machine gun was shooting upward relative to the plane. That corresponds to the upward bullet path found in the body. That said, in theory, an unknown infantry rifleman on the ground could also have fired the shot from Richthofen's right flank. Several riflemen did take shots at the red plane as it passed overhead. This unknown soldier theory cannot be entirely dismissed, as any Lee Enfield firing the same sort of ammo could have caused the same wound if the timing and angle were just right. However, no specific rifleman ever came forward with convincing evidence, and the volume of machine gun fire makes it more likely a machine gunner hit the target. Given all the available data, most historians and forensic experts conclude that the shot almost certainly came from the ground, not from Roy Brown's camel. Popkin, being in the best position and having an optimal angle of fire, remains by far the top contender in the analysis of von Richthofen's demise. It's worth noting that the initial autopsy report back in 1918 didn't reach the same conclusion. The British surgeons who examined Manfred von Richthofen's body right after the crash believed that the bullet's angle was too steep to have come from ground fire. This led them to attribute the wound to Brown's attack from the air. This early assessment was accepted officially at the time, which is why Brown was credited. In hindsight, many historians consider that autopsy finding to be flawed, or at least incomplete. Others suspect that the findings of the British medical team at the time may not have been truly independent or fact-based. The idea that the Red Baron was shot down by ground-based soldiers likely wouldn't have had a similar propaganda effect as the greatest German aerial ace being bested by the RAF. Further, the Germans could have lessened the morale blow to their populace by claiming that the Red Baron hadn't really been felled in honorable aerial combat. Officially, the victory is still attributed to Roy Brown, despite significant evidence to the contrary. That said, even though it appears that Brown and the RAF didn't actually land the final blow, this isn't to diminish their role in the event. To the contrary, without Brown and company essentially putting the Red Baron in a checkmate position, Popkin or an unknown rifleman would have never had the opportunity they were presented. In the autumn of 1969, a brutal crime in Oakland, California, left behind a mystery that endures to this day. On October 2nd, 1969, staff at the St. Louis Hotel on 7th Street in Oakland discovered the body of a recently deceased young woman in room 15. The scene was extremely grim and violent. An autopsy later revealed she had been beaten severely and then strangled, reportedly with a piece of her own clothing. The coroner determined she had died only a few hours before she was found, meaning the perpetrator likely fled not long before the body's discovery. There was no identification found with her, nothing that immediately gave away who she was. Oakland police detectives were faced with two urgent tasks: identify the victim and catch whoever was responsible for this horrific act. Early clues gave investigators some leads on the second task. Witnesses reported seeing the young woman enter the hotel room with a man earlier that day. The description of that man was alarming. It appeared to match Taylor Morris Teaford, a fugitive already wanted by the FBI. Teaford was a 34-year-old man with a history of violence, and he had been on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list since 1968 for a variety of extremely violent offenses. According to later reports, Tieford was indeed suspected of attacking multiple women in Northern California around that time. Investigators came to believe that Tieford was the man in the hotel with the Jane Doe, and likely the perpetrator. In 1972, although Tieford was still at large, authorities charged him in absentia with the slaying of the unidentified woman. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and the case effectively became a hunt for a fugitive killer and of his victim. Tieford, however, evaded capture, and over the years, he was rumored to have been seen in various places across the country, but he was never arrested for this crime. By all accounts, he lived a life on the run. Given his age, he would be in his late 80s as of today, so it's quite possible he died a fugitive. With the prime suspect out of reach, the case stalled. Yet even as the search for Tieford went on, a parallel investigation continued to try to identify the young woman he was believed to have slain. Her fingerprints were taken and checked against databases of missing persons and criminal records of the time, but no match was found. In 1969, there were no DNA tests or national computer systems to aid the search, so investigators relied on physical clues and old-fashioned legwork. They carefully noted her appearance and belongings, hoping something would trigger recognition from the public. The victim was described as a white female, estimated to be in her late teens to mid-20s. She had short, dark brown or auburn hair and striking blue eyes, which investigators believe would have been a particularly memorable feature. Despite her youth, one distinctive feature stood out. She wore a partial dental plate replacing her upper front tooth. This was a professionally made denture piece and had been repaired multiple times, suggesting she'd lost that tooth sometime earlier and had worn the denture for a while. Investigators publicized this unusual detail, thinking perhaps a dentist or someone who knew her might recognize it. They also noted she had some faded scars along her right forearm and evidence of needle marks on her arms, indicating likely substance use issues. At the crime scene, in addition to the white knit dress she was wearing, there were several other articles of clothing presumably belonging to her. Investigators found colorful bell-bottom pants, a bright patterned blouse, a striped mini dress, a white sweater, and white knee-high boots. These fashionable, youth-oriented clothes painted a picture of a young woman living in the late 1960s style. All of these details were documented and released to the media in hopes that a missing persons report somewhere might match up, but initially, no leads materialized on her identity. Presumably, there may be additional details which weren't released to the media, though I would imagine at this point, the authorities couldn't be holding too much back. Or at least, I would hope that's the case, because at this point, the crime is almost 60 years past. So yeah, I think it's time to go for the Hail Mary pass. From the very beginning, the mystery woman's identity has been the subject of much speculation. Who was this young Jane Doe, and what circumstances led her into the company of a dangerous man like Taylor Tieford, or perhaps an as yet unknown, but also extremely dangerous individual? One early theory was that she may have been involved in escort work. This raised the possibility that the Alameda County Jane Doe wasn't an isolated case, but part of a series of slayings targeting women in this line of work in Northern California. The brutality of the crime and the hotel setting did align with what law enforcement often saw in cases of predators preying on vulnerable young women. The escort theory could explain why no immediate missing person report matched the victim. If she had been estranged from family or living under the radar, her disappearance might not have been noted right away. Another theory has been that the Jane Doe was a runaway or transient who traveled to California during the tumultuous late 1960s. The Bay Area was a magnet for young people in that era: hitchhikers, flower children, and those drawn by the counterculture movement. But sadly, not all of those journeys ended well. It's possible the victim had come from another state, leaving home as a teenager and losing touch with her family. Her substance use evidence might point to a difficult life on the streets or involvement in the 1960s counterculture. If she had been moving from place to place, her family, if she had one searching for her, might not have known she was in Oakland. Further missing persons records back then were not well coordinated nationally. This could explain why her identity didn't surface immediately. In 1969, a missing young woman from another jurisdiction wouldn't automatically be connected to an unidentified body in California. Even today, with the vast interconnectivity brought to us by the digital age, this is still the case, though to a lesser extent. Over the years, various potential identities have been examined. Periodically, when a long-term missing person case seemed to match the Jane Doe's profile, authorities would compare details. For instance, one candidate that drew attention was a teen girl who went missing from Missouri in 1963, around the same age and physical description. With this case, and with many others, fingerprints and dental records would later rule out any connection. In the decades since 1969, the case of the Alameda County Jane Doe has never been completely forgotten. Investigators and advocates continue to pursue new ways to identify her, even long after the trail went cold. One significant modern effort has been the use of forensic reconstruction to put a face to the victim beyond the old morgue photographs. This image has been circulated in law enforcement bulletins and online cold case communities. By sharing the reconstructed likeness along with details of the case, authorities hope that it might jog the memory of a witness or prompt a family member to come forward with information. After all, even though many years have passed, there is a chance that someone out there remembers a girl who went missing around 1969 and never knew what happened to her. Advances in technology have also opened new avenues. The late 20th century and early 21st brought DNA analysis into crime solving, and more recently, genetic genealogy has cracked hundreds of cold cases. In principle, this technique could be the key to giving the 1969 Jane Doe her name. Forensic genealogy involves extracting DNA from the remains, building a genetic profile, and searching genealogical databases for relatives. In practice, however, this case faces a hurdle: the availability of viable DNA. Records indicate that no DNA profile has yet been obtained from the victim's remains. Given the era of the case, her body may have been buried without the preservation of samples, or any DNA that exists might be highly degraded. That said, technology is constantly improving, and even trace genetic material from decades-old evidence can sometimes yield results now. There have been discussions about exhumation or retesting old evidence to try to get a DNA sample. If successful, investigators could potentially enlist organizations that specialize in cold case identifications to apply genealogical research. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder for you to share this video with 2 of your friends or your family members. Also, remember to hit like and subscribe, and also remember to ring the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also, don't forget to check out my history channel and my true crime channel if you want more of my content. It was a scene that could have been pulled from a heist thriller. On the evening of May 25th, 2003, as dusk settled over 4 de Fevereiro International Airport in Luanda, Angola, a large Boeing 727 airliner unexpectedly began lumbering down the runway. There were no lights on the aircraft and no communication with the control tower. Air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as the unregistered jet picked up speed. Without clearance, it roared into the air and banked toward the southwest, vanishing into the twilight over the Atlantic Ocean. In the cockpit, by most accounts, were 2 men, an American aviation engineer and a Congolese mechanic. neither of whom was fully qualified to fly that plane. The Boeing 727 and the men on board have never been seen again. The aircraft at the center of this mystery was a Boeing 727-223 model, a three-engine jetliner built in 1975. For 25 years, it flew passengers across the United States as part of the American Airlines fleet. By 2001, the aging 727 was retired from commercial service. A Miami-based company called Aerospace Sales and Leasing, led by businessman Maury Joseph, acquired the plane, seeing opportunity in its remaining value. The jet, still bearing its faded American Airlines livery of unpolished silver skin with blue, white, and red stripes, was reconfigured for a new life. All the passenger seats were stripped out of its cabin, and it was outfitted with large fuel tanks, essentially converting it into a flying fuel tanker. The plan was to use the 727 to ferry diesel fuel to remote diamond mining operations in Angola, a country where ground transport was perilous after decades of civil war. In early 2002, the Boeing 727, now identified by its tail number N844AA, was flown from the United States to Africa. A South African entrepreneur named Keith Irwin had leased the aircraft from Joseph's company for the fuel delivery venture. He assembled a crew and installed 10 collapsible fuel tanks inside the plane's fuselage. The jet departed Miami at the end of February 2002 and arrived in Luanda, Angola in mid-March after delays. However, upon arrival, the business deal began to unravel. The Angolan client failed to pay the promised funds, leaving the crew stranded and the aircraft stuck on the airport tarmac. Over the next weeks, tensions grew, and the foreign flight crew faced harsh living conditions and even feared for their safety amid the turbulent environment. Disputes escalated to the point where some crew members quietly plotted to fly the 727 out of Angola on their own to escape the situation. Only intervention by the U.S. Embassy resolved the standoff, allowing the crew to recover their passports and leave the country. One by one, the disheartened pilots and engineers returned home, and by mid-2002, the hastily conceived fuel hauling operation had collapsed. What remained was the airplane itself, abandoned at Luanda's airport with no flight crew and mounting debts. The once proud jetliner sat idle for over a year, one of a couple of derelict planes at the field. During those 14 months of inactivity, it accrued an eye-watering sum of over $4 million in parking fees and other charges. Weather and lack of maintenance took a toll on the 727's condition. By late 2002, its future was uncertain. The aircraft was essentially a hostage to unpaid bills and a failed venture. Maury Joseph, the owner, still had a stake in the plane and its valuable engines, and he wasn't ready to write it off. Joseph negotiated with authorities and sought a solution to either get the jet flying again or at least recoup his losses by selling its parts. By spring 2003, he had arranged for the 727 to be repaired, refueled, and flown out of Angola to be delivered to a new customer in South Africa. To carry out this plan, Joseph turned to a trusted contractor, an American man named Ben Padilla, to oversee the refurbishment and retrieval of the aircraft. Ben Padilla was the main figure on the ground in Angola, working to reclaim the 727. Padilla was a 50-year-old aircraft mechanic and certified flight engineer from Florida. He was no stranger to aviation challenges. He had years of experience maintaining and ferrying airplanes, including working in various African countries. Though Padilla had a private pilot's license, he wasn't qualified to fly a large jet airliner like the Boeing 727 as a captain. Still, he was resourceful and knowledgeable about this specific plane, and he had been involved with it during previous jobs for Maury Joseph. In April 2003, Padilla arrived in Luanda as Joseph's agent. His mission was to pay off the outstanding fees, hire local technicians, and restore the long-neglected 727 to airworthiness. By all accounts, Padilla threw himself into the task. He coordinated with an Angolan maintenance firm and even arranged to hire a crew from a local airline, including a qualified pilot and co-pilot, to fly the jet out once it was ready. Padilla's family later described him as a man who would not have casually risked flying that big jet alone. Simply put, they didn't believe he was a big risk taker. They believe he must have been swept up in events beyond his control. Alongside Padilla was John Michael Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo. Mutantu had been hired recently to assist Padilla with the repairs. Little is publicly known about Mutantu's background. He was essentially a contract worker brought in for his technical skills. What is known, though, is that he wasn't a pilot at all, but a mechanic helping to get the Boeing ready for its ferry flight. Mutantu and Padilla worked together in those final weeks of May 2003, replacing parts, testing systems, and fueling the jet for its much-anticipated departure. These two men would ultimately become the central characters in the plane's disappearance, as they were the ones last seen aboard the aircraft before it vanished. Neither Padilla nor Mutantu has been heard from since the day of the disappearance. Another key player in this saga is Maury Joseph, the owner of the aircraft. Joseph was not on site in Angola at the time of the disappearance, but he had orchestrated the effort to recover the plane. A businessman based in Miami, Joseph had what some have alleged to be a slightly checkered history in the aviation leasing world. However, other sources indicate that none of his business practices were out of the ordinary for high-risk airplane leasing. He wasn't in Angola at the time of the disappearance. Instead, he was awaiting the jet's delivery to a buyer in South Africa. On the day the plane went missing, Joseph was in Johannesburg, expecting to greet his crew and client. Little did he know what would happen next. By late May 2003, the Boeing 727 was finally in taxiing condition after extensive repairs. Padilla had settled many of the airport fines using funds from the owner, and the plan was to fly the aircraft out within days. On the afternoon of Sunday, May 25th, Padilla made arrangements for a final test. He intended to taxi the 727 to the main runway and perform a high-power engine run-up, a common procedure to check the systems under load. That evening, as the golden light of sunset tinged the airport, the 727 indeed began to move. But what happened next was anything but a routine test. Shortly before 5 p.m. local time, to the surprise of ground staff, the Boeing 727 suddenly powered up and started rolling toward the runway. Ben Padilla and John Mutantu had been seen boarding the aircraft moments before. No other qualified pilot was with them, and crucially, the two had no clearance to take off. An airport employee later reported seeing only one person in the cockpit, but others were certain both men had climbed aboard. The control tower tried frantically to hail the 727 on the radio, but there was only silence. The big jetliner swung erratically into position on the runway. Its landing lights were switched off, and its transponder, the device that identifies an aircraft on radar, was not transmitting. Essentially, the aircraft had gone both dark and rogue on the airfield. Ground personnel could only watch as the 727 barreled down the runway. Gaining speed, it lifted off into the evening sky without permission. Tower controllers kept calling out to the plane with no response. The jet turned southwest, heading out over the Atlantic Ocean, and within minutes it disappeared from Luanda's radar. Just like that, the massive plane was gone. It carried with it the two men, and also an enormous quantity of fuel. The aircraft's tanks had been topped up with 14,000 gallons of fuel, enough for roughly 1,500 miles of flight. This fuel would allow it to reach many destinations across Africa. As darkness fell, no one knew whether the aircraft was flying steadily toward some clandestine landing spot, or if it was in trouble and about to crash into the sea. The airport authorities in Luanda were in disbelief and alarm. They had a missing airliner on their hands, one that had essentially been stolen in plain sight. Immediate attempts to locate or contact the aircraft were fruitless. In neighboring countries, air traffic monitors were asked if they had any unidentified blips on their radar screens, but none did. The 727 seemed to have vanished into thin air. Back in Johannesburg, owner Maury Joseph was expecting the plane's arrival the next day. Instead, he got the call that every owner of a commercial airliner dreads. His plane was stolen from the runway. And honestly, I wrote that line without thinking about how absurd it sounds. And yes, I decided it was too good and silly not to keep it in. An Angolan aviation official demanded to know why Joseph's plane had left with an unauthorized crew and under such weird circumstances. Joseph quickly called the U.S. Embassy and his contacts to report that his airplane had been stolen. And it's important to remember that this happened very soon after the events of 2001, so the world immediately went on highest alert. The disappearance of the Boeing from Angola triggered a global investigation and a whirlwind of speculation. In the hours and days after the plane went missing, American authorities, including the FBI, CIA, and State Department, worked alongside international agencies to track down any trace of the jet. If someone intended to use this plane as a weapon or for illegal activities, the clock was ticking. Intelligence analysts scanned satellite images for signs of a crash, perhaps an oil slick on the ocean or scorched earth in the African bush. Military surveillance teams considered the possibility of intercepting the rogue aircraft if it appeared on any radar. For a time, U.S. officials even contemplated moving fighter jets into positions in Africa, ready to respond if the 727 was spotted threatening any strategic targets. In those tense initial hours and days, it was as if a ghost plane was haunting the authorities' imaginations. Despite the intense search, no definitive sightings or wreckage were found. False leads cropped up. At one point, rumors suggested the aircraft might have crashed off the coast, or that it landed at an abandoned strip somewhere in Central Africa. In July 2003, about a month after the disappearance, a tantalizing report emerged from West Africa. A veteran pilot claimed to have spotted a mysteriously familiar Boeing 727 at an airport in Conakry, Guinea. The plane he saw had a new paint job and a Guinean registration number, but faintly visible on its tail were the telltale letters AA, the same last letters of the U.S. registration. This eyewitness was convinced it was the missing Angola 727, potentially being used to covertly haul cargo. The report caused a stir, but when U.S. officials investigated further, they concluded it was a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps even a hoax. The Guinean plane, they said, wasn't the stolen jet after all, and hope of an easy answer evaporated. With an enduring mystery and no hard facts, various theories have taken root over the years. One of the simplest explanations is a tragic accident. The Boeing 727 was a complex aircraft requiring 3 trained crew members to fly safely. On that evening, it likely had just Ben Padilla at the controls, a man who, while experienced with aircraft, was not certified to fly a 727. John Mutantu, the mechanic, would have been of little to no help in the cockpit given his skill set. It's entirely possible that once airborne, the makeshift crew found the jetliner too much plane to handle. A mispiloted turn, an instrument mix-up, or an in-flight emergency could have led the plane to crash into the Atlantic Ocean not long after takeoff, before anyone could even report a sighting. If the 727 plunged into deep tropical waters, heavy with fuel, it might have sunk almost intact, leaving little to no debris for searchers to find. Padilla's own family leans toward this theory. They fear that he died in a crash after getting the plane off the ground. perhaps heroically trying to save it from disaster until the last moment. Another possibility is that the plane did not crash at all, but was stolen for clandestine purposes. Could Ben or John themselves have been in on such a heist, or were they overpowered by others? Some have speculated that a third person might have snuck on board the 727, or that Padilla and Mutantu were forced to fly the aircraft to a secret location. The plane had enough fuel to fly about 4 to 5 hours, putting a vast radius of remote Africa within reach. Conceivably, the jet could have headed inland and landed on an isolated airstrip in a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo or elsewhere, far from prying eyes. A 727 alongside someone who could fly it, and a mechanic, could be extremely useful to a warlord or a criminal cartel. Under this theory, after the chaotic takeoff, the aircraft might have been flown to a prearranged hiding spot, its exterior quickly repainted and identity changed. It could have been stashed in a hangar or camouflaged at a remote airfield. Even today it might be out there somewhere, quietly rusting away or continuing to operate under a false identity. This idea sounds like the plot of a movie, but it's a scenario investigators considered seriously for a time. In the absence of answers, the fate of the Angola Boeing has remained one of aviation's great unsolved mysteries. The FBI formally closed its case in 2005, having turned up no leads that could definitively explain what happened. Otto Warmbier was a 21-year-old American college student from Ohio who traveled to North Korea in late 2015 as part of a guided tour. Warmbier joined a Young Pioneer Tours group, a China-based travel agency advertising trips to North Korea as safe and adventurous. On New Year's Eve 2015, he and other tourists celebrated in Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung Square and later returned to their hotel, the Yanggakdo International Hotel. In the early hours of January 1, 2016, North Korean authorities alleged that Warmbier attempted to steal a propaganda poster from a restricted staff-only area of the hotel as a trophy. Notably, it remains an open question whether the person who actually committed this act was Otto, or if it was another member of his party. The next day, January 2nd, Warmbier was detained at Pyongyang's airport, just before he could board a flight home. A British tour member witnessed North Korean agents approach Warmbier calmly and escort him away without resistance. North Korea's state news agency announced that an American had been arrested for a hostile act against the state, though details were initially withheld. Warmbier's tour group departed without him, and he disappeared into the nightmare that is North Korean custody. For several weeks there was silence about Warmbier's fate. Then, on February 29, 2016, North Korean authorities produced Warmbier for a staged press conference in Pyongyang. With head bowed, he tearfully quote-unquote confessed to severe crimes against the North Korean state. Reading from a prepared statement, Warmbier said he tried to take the poster on behalf of a church. He claimed the church was working at the behest of the American government, and the purpose was to harm North Korea's work ethic. Observers suspected this extremely odd confession to this bizarre offense was coerced by torture, noting he appeared to speak under obvious duress. Further, they also noted he used language in the confession which was in line with the ideology of North Korea, which is, to put it mildly, not the typical language of an American college student. Nonetheless, the regime pressed forward. On March 16, 2016, North Korea's Supreme Court held a 1-hour trial, convicting Warmbier of subversion. He was found to be acting as an American agent undermining the regime. Evidence presented included the forced confession, but that wasn't the end of it. Other evidence included CCTV footage, purportedly showing a figure removing a wall poster, fingerprint evidence, and a hotel staff witness. Notably, it's not even clear whether it was Otto himself removing the wall poster. Warmbier himself begged for forgiveness, calling the incident, quote, the worst mistake of my life. The court sentenced him to 15 years of hard labor in a North Korean prison, a punishment the U.S. State Department denounced as politically motivated and excessively harsh. International observers widely described the proceeding as a kangaroo court, lacking any semblance of due process. But then things took a turn for the tragic, and things would go from bad to worse for this young man abroad. In April 2016, roughly 1 month into his prison term, Warmbier reportedly suffered a severe neurological injury and fell into a coma. Disturbingly, North Korean officials didn't disclose this to the outside world for over a year. During his captivity, no American or international diplomats were allowed to see him. Sweden, which serves as the protecting power for U.S. interests in North Korea, was repeatedly denied consular access. North Korea finally broke the silence in June 2017, claiming that shortly after Warmbier's trial, he had contracted botulism and slipped into a coma after taking a sleeping pill. According to accounts relayed by North Korean officials to the United States, Warmbier had been treated at Pyongyang's Friendship Hospital while in a vegetative state. Medical records turned over by North Korea indicated he had been comatose since April 2016. According to the North Korean regime, the state insisted they kept him alive through diligent care and were now considering releasing him on, quote, humanitarian grounds. In their words, the North Koreans had selflessly sacrificed their resources to keep an American subversive alive, a take that outsiders found to be unhinged. In May 2017, as a new U.S. administration took office, secret talks between American and North Korean envoys opened a door. In early June 2017, the U.S. State Department learned of Warmbier's grave medical condition during a meeting with North Korean representatives in New York. Upon hearing that Warmbier was comatose, President Trump directed officials to take all necessary measures to bring the young man home. On June 12, 2017, U.S. State Department Special Envoy Joseph Yun flew to Pyongyang with a medical team to negotiate Warmbier's evacuation. Yun was permitted a visit to the hospital, the first time any American had seen Otto in 17 months, and he demanded Warmbier's immediate release, to which North Korea agreed. On June 13, 2017, Otto Warmbier was flown out of North Korea. He arrived in his home state of Ohio that evening, carried off the plane pale and unresponsive, with a feeding tube and breathing apparatus in place. Doctors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, who quickly assumed his care, described his condition as a state of unresponsive wakefulness, or persistent vegetative state. Warmbier could breathe on his own and occasionally blink, but he showed no signs of awareness or purposeful response. Brain scans provided by North Korea, dated April and July 2016, revealed extensive brain tissue loss, consistent with a prolonged period of oxygen deprivation to the brain. The lead doctor noted that Warmbier's injury likely resulted from a cardiopulmonary arrest. In other words, his heart or lungs had stopped for a period, causing catastrophic brain damage. Importantly, the medical team found no evidence of a botulism infection in his system at any point, directly contradicting North Korea's story of events. Curiously, Otto's body was fairly well nourished, and there were no healed fractures or external marks of trauma, according to the examining physicians. Tragically, Otto Warmbier never regained consciousness, and just 6 days after coming home, on the afternoon of June 19, 2017, he died in hospital. He was just 22 years old and cut down in the prime of his life. News of his death sent shockwaves through the United States. Both Republicans and Democrats were willing to put aside their differences to condemn the North Korean state for the cruel acts committed against Otto. North Korea, for its part, emphatically denied wrongdoing, and you'll never guess what they did next. The regime's foreign ministry called itself, quote, the biggest victim in the incident, claiming that Warmbier's death was a complete mystery to them. Pyongyang's officials insisted that they had treated Otto with the best care in the world. In the wake of Warmbier's death, the United States banned its citizens from traveling to North Korea as of September 2017, citing the serious risk of detention and mistreatment. In late 2018, a U.S. federal court, hearing a wrongful death lawsuit filed by the Warmbiers, found North Korea liable for Otto's imprisonment, torture, and death. Notably, this was issued by way of a default judgment, which in essence means that the North Korean state didn't reply to the lawsuit. Otto Warmbier's case left haunting questions that remain unresolved. Multiple theories have been floated about what really happened to Warmbier during those lost 17 months in North Korea. North Korean officials maintain that botulism was to blame, that he fell ill from contaminated food, took a sleeping pill, and never woke up. However, U.S. doctors found no traces of botulism toxin in his system, and many medical experts believe such a scenario is unlikely, if not impossible, given the evidence. Some neurologists cautioned that botulism could technically not be entirely ruled out due to the long delay in Otto's return, but no concrete proof of it was ever found. Warmbier's parents firmly believe he was brutally beaten and tortured into a coma by his captors. Fred Warmbier has publicly and repeatedly reminded the world that Otto was tortured beyond belief by the North Korean regime. Notably, some have denied that Otto was tortured on the basis that when he returned stateside, he had no signs of healed fractures or external trauma. To interject on a personal level here, I find this position extremely questionable to say the least. The North Korean regime has no regard for the life of its own citizens, and routinely, quote-unquote, re-educates them. I suspect that the North Korean state employs some bad men familiar with the ways of torture. It's possible that if abuse occurred, it may have been in the form of prolonged sleep deprivation, psychological stress, or asphyxiation methods that left no obvious marks. In the end, every explanation remains frustratingly incomplete. What is clear is that Otto Warmbier entered North Korea a healthy, curious university student eager for adventure, and he left it broken beyond repair. The exact chain of events that led to his coma and eventual death may never be fully known. That said, his family needs closure, so I would hope that the North Koreans come clean as to what actually happened to him. And while I realize this may sound like a crazy concept, the North Koreans have previously withheld information on what really happened to prisoners as a diplomatic bargaining chip. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to take a moment to share this video with your friends and on your socials. Also, if you didn't know, I also have two other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. These channels revolve around historical content and resolve true crime cases respectively, so check them out after you're done here. In early 2025, nearly 60 years after Dorothy Vaillancourt disappeared, authorities finally put a name to a mystery that had haunted Northern California for decades. A set of unidentified remains found on a hillside in 1966 was positively identified as Dorothy, an Australian-born mother of 7. For decades, she was known only as the Marin County Jane Doe, but advancements in forensic DNA technology eventually cracked the case and brought partial closure to her family. Despite this, another question now looms. What happened to Dorothy and why? On December 18, 1966, a local hunter made a grim discovery near the end of Paradise Drive in Tiburon, California. He stumbled upon the body of a woman at the bottom of a brush-covered cliffside, about 20 feet down the hill from the roadside. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, and the coroner later estimated that the woman had been dead for approximately 2 months. The woman appeared to be middle-aged, roughly between 40 and 60 years old, standing about 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing around 105 pounds. Due to the condition of the body, authorities could not immediately determine how she had died. No obvious cause of death could be established from the remains. It was clear, however, that this woman had died alone on a quiet Marin County hillside, and that no one had reported her missing. Investigators with the Marin County Sheriff's Office began working to identify the unknown woman. In the 1960s, tools like DNA profiling and nationwide databases didn't exist, so detectives relied on traditional methods. They checked missing persons reports, sent out bulletins across California, and scoured local leads. There was speculation that she might have been a patient who wandered away from a San Francisco psychiatric hospital or a traveler who had stayed at a nearby motel. Each lead, however, led nowhere, and the woman's identity remained a mystery. A crucial clue emerged a few days after the body's discovery. A Tiburon fireman came forward on December 21, 1966, to report an encounter he had remembered from 3 months prior. He told the sheriff's investigators that back in the late summer or early fall, a woman matching the Jane Doe's description had showed up at the local fire station. The woman had told the fireman she was stranded and didn't have money for a taxi ride. She asked if she could spend the night at the fire station or even borrow the firefighter's car, but he refused both requests and didn't take any further action. The fireman last saw her walking away down to Barron Boulevard in September 1966. This witness account strongly suggested that the unidentified woman found in December was the same person, meaning she had been alive and in distress a few months before her death. Despite this lead, investigators still did not know her name. With no identification and no immediate matches to missing persons, the case went cold. After the initial flurry of investigation in the late 1960s, the Marin County Jane Doe case lingered on the shelves of cold case detectives. The unknown woman was buried in an unmarked grave at Mount Tamalpais Cemetery in San Rafael, California, and for years her tombstone bore no name. All the while, Dorothy Vaillancourt's family was suffering, not knowing what became of her. Dorothy's 7 children had been separated from their mother in the mid-1960s. In fact, her family spent years actively searching for her, never imagining that the unidentified Jane Doe in Marin County was their missing mother. Dorothy's daughter, Penelope Vaillancourt, who was a teenager when her mother vanished, never gave up trying to find answers. She would ride buses through San Francisco, scanning the faces in the streets for a glimpse of her mother's familiar features. The family reached out to agencies like the FBI and local cold case units, and even checked cemeteries for unidentified graves, hoping for any clue to Dorothy's fate. At one point, Penelope even visited the Australian consulate in San Francisco, thinking her mother might have tried to return to her homeland. Her children suspected that Dorothy's disappearance might be tied to a man in her life, and without evidence of her death, they had little closure. The cold case of Marin County's Jane Doe finally saw progress in the 21st century thanks to forensic genealogy. In 2022, the California Department of Justice and the Marin County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram to re-examine the evidence from the 1966 case. Othram was conducting a special program to tackle unsolved cases with no other leads, and the Marin case was a prime candidate. Using a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing, Othram's scientists were able to extract a comprehensive DNA profile from the decades-old remains. Once Othram had a DNA profile, their in-house forensic genealogists compared it against public genetic databases to find relatives. This painstaking family tree research eventually led to a break in late 2024. A set of genetic matches pointed to relatives of the unidentified woman. By reconstructing the family lineage, investigators homed in on a particular family with ties to Australia. In early 2025, Marin County Sheriff's officials contacted surviving family members of a long-lost woman and obtained DNA reference samples from them. These samples confirmed what the genealogy strongly suggested. The Marin County Jane Doe was Dorothy. The identification was formally announced on March 20th, 2025, ending the nearly 59-year mystery of the Jane Doe's name. Identifying the remains as Dorothy Vaillancourt also shed light on the life story behind the victim. She had been born Dorothy Jean Williams in 1917 in Hobart, Tasmania, an island state of Australia. She grew up in Tasmania and trained as a nurse, and during World War II, Dorothy was working at a Sydney hospital when she met a young American serviceman, Francois Vaillancourt. Francois, an American of French-Canadian descent who went by Frank, was a U.S. Marine who had served in the Pacific Theater. The couple married during the war, and after 1945, Dorothy left Australia to begin a new life with her husband in North America. They briefly stayed in Francois' hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, then moved west to San Francisco, California, to settle down. In San Francisco, the Vaillancourts built a family, and Francois worked as a house painter, and Dorothy continued her nursing career in the city. They had 7 children together, and were initially a happy family. However, the good times weren't destined to last. The strain of raising a large family and personal issues took a toll on the marriage. The Vaillancourts eventually divorced in the early 1960s, and Dorothy struggled in the aftermath. She developed a serious alcohol problem and had difficulty holding down a job. Child welfare authorities became concerned about the children's care. Ultimately, the 7 kids were placed in group homes in the San Francisco area during the mid-1960s. Around this time, Dorothy became involved with a new man, one who would later factor into theories about her fate. She met a German immigrant named Hermann Julius Hess and remarried in June 1964. The pair bought a house in Fairfax, a town in Marin County north of San Francisco. At first it may have seemed like a fresh start for Dorothy, but her new German husband had a dark side. He claimed to have been a figure of authority in the Third Reich, a claim that appears to have likely been made up to instill fear in Dorothy. Whether this was true or not, what was definitely true is that Hess had a violent temper. Penelope and her siblings later described disturbing incidents. In one confrontation, Hess punched 14-year-old Penelope in the face. When her brother intervened, Hess violently attacked the brother and tried to strangle Penelope until the police were called. In the wake of that incident, Hess was arrested. However, the records of this incident now appear to be lost to time. After Hess's arrest, the children, who had briefly been reunited with their mother, were removed from the home in Fairfax. Some of the children went back to live with their father, Frank, but others were sent to orphanages or foster homes. Dorothy remained with Hess in Marin County after the children were gone. By late 1965, Dorothy and Hess were struggling financially. They were court-ordered to sell their Fairfax home to cover debts. The historical record becomes spotty after that, but it appears that at some point in 1966, Dorothy and Hermann Hess separated or fell out of touch. Dorothy, battling alcoholism and having lost her stable home, essentially became transient. The last known sighting of her while alive was the encounter at the fire station in the fall of 1966. With Dorothy Vaillancourt's identity now established, the focus turns to how she died and what led to her body being left on that steep Tiburon slope. Unfortunately, this aspect of the case remains unsolved. Back in 1966, the coroner could not determine a cause of death due to the decomposition and lack of obvious injuries. All that could be said was that she likely died around October 1966, roughly 2 months before discovery, and that her death was not immediately attributable to any cause. Whether Dorothy's demise was the result of foul play, an accident, or some other misfortune is still unknown. The Marin County Sheriff's Office has not publicly stated whether they have reopened a criminal investigation now that Dorothy has been identified. As of the identification in 2025, officials simply acknowledged that the manner of her death is unclear and still under investigation. Several theories have emerged as to what happened to her. One theory points to Herman Hess, Dorothy's second husband, as a possible culprit. Given Hess's documented violence toward Dorothy and her children, some of Dorothy's surviving family members believe he may have had something to do with her death. Perhaps, they speculate, Hess and Dorothy met one last time in 1966, and an altercation occurred that resulted in Dorothy's death. Supporting this theory is Hess's behavior and the timing. Dorothy vanished not long after separating from him. However, Herman Hess himself is, with certainty, deceased, given that he was born in 1911. If Hess did harm Dorothy, he cannot be brought to justice now, but confirming his involvement would at least answer the family's lingering questions. Another theory is that Dorothy's death could have been a tragic accident or the result of exposure. It's possible that on the night she died, Dorothy was walking alone along the quiet road, perhaps under the influence. In her vulnerable state, she could have stumbled into danger. A hit-and-run incident is one potential scenario. A driver may have hit her and then, in a panic, tossed her body down the embankment to cover up what had happened. Alternatively, Dorothy might have simply lost her footing on the edge of the road and fallen down the slope, succumbing to injuries or exposure without anyone around to help. Another theory focuses on the somewhat odd actions of the firefighter who had seen her a few months prior to her discovery. This theory is entirely speculative, but as the last known person to have seen her alive, some have placed suspicion on him. It's unknown what investigative steps were taken with respect to him at the time Dorothy was discovered, and it's unknown whether he's still alive. Still another theory suggests that Dorothy may have intentionally went off the embankment in a successful effort to end it all. The evidence to support this is entirely circumstantial. However, Dorothy had essentially lost everything. Her family had been taken away from her, and her second marriage, albeit to an absolute monster, had just collapsed. Further, she was suffering from substance use issues, which may have compounded her existing problems. I hope to have an update on what happened to Dorothy in a future episode. On September 19, 1977, 52-year-old Yutaka Kume vanished without a trace from the Noto Peninsula in Ishikawa Prefecture in Japan. What initially appeared to be a simple local disappearance spiraled into a massive international incident, likely involving North Korean agents. Kume, a security guard employed at Tokyo's Mitaka City Hall, had traveled to the scenic coastal area reportedly for a short trip. The day before he disappeared, he phoned a colleague and casually mentioned, quote, "I'm at a hot spring in the Noto Peninsula right now," which would be the last time anyone heard from him. The next day, Kume was seen walking along a beach near the town of Ushitsu in Noto, and then he simply never returned. Initial efforts to find Kume yielded few clues, and local police combed the coastline and interviewed residents, but no witnesses could clearly explain what happened that evening. In the absence of immediate evidence of foul play, speculation began to swirl. Strangely, a local newspaper in November 1977 even suggested that Kume might have defected to North Korea by boat. This idea, that a middle-aged City Hall security guard would abruptly flee Japan for North Korea, seemed far-fetched. Yet, with no body found and Kume gone, more conventional theories, such as an accidental drowning or voluntary disappearance, struggled to account for the mystery. Unbeknownst to the public at the time, however, Japanese police had already encountered alarming signs that something far more sinister had occurred on that Noto beach. Behind the scenes, investigators had suspicions that were not immediately revealed to the media. On the very evening of Kume's disappearance, police in Ishikawa received a report of a suspicious boat spotted in nearby Toyama Bay. That night, Kume was staying at a local inn with another man, and the inn's owner grew uneasy when the pair went out late, since there was nowhere obvious to go after dark on the quiet coast. The police were put on high alert, and officers rushed to the area. They arrived to find that Kume was already gone, but his companion, a Korean national identified only as Lee, was still on shore. Lee was promptly arrested, though only on minor charges of violating immigration registration laws. When police searched his belongings and home, they uncovered clandestine tools of espionage, including cipher tables and code books. These startling finds strongly suggested that Lee was a North Korean agent or collaborator involved in a covert operation. Despite these red flags, the case did not immediately transform into a well-publicized kidnapping investigation. Incredibly, Lee was never prosecuted for abducting Kume. He was released after a suspended indictment, and even later allowed to naturalize as a Japanese citizen. At the time, authorities treated the incident cautiously. The full details were kept quiet, and for years the public narrative barely acknowledged any crime. In fact, the incident was long reported merely as a minor story about a Japanese man illegally leaving Japan for the Korean peninsula. Over the following decades, patterns began to emerge that cast Kume's disappearance in a new light. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a number of Japanese citizens mysteriously vanished, many of them from coastal areas, under puzzling circumstances. By the 1990s, the families of these missing people, alongside the help of investigative journalists, started connecting the dots. What they discovered was one of the biggest stories in post-war Japanese history. They suspected that North Korean agents had been covertly kidnapping Japanese citizens during that era. These once unthinkable claims gained credibility through evidence and even admissions by North Korean operatives. Eventually, the Japanese government officially recognized 17 cases of abduction by North Korean spies, with Yutaka Kume listed as the earliest known victim. Kume's case, in particular, fits the now established pattern of North Korean abductions. According to investigations by Japanese police, Kume was targeted by a North Korean spy network operating inside Japan. In Tokyo, he was approached by a man later identified as Kim Si-ho, a North Korean agent using the alias Yoshida. Kim, with the help of several North Korean residents in Japan, allegedly enticed Kume with a proposal for a lucrative business deal. This ruse was likely a trap. Once Kume agreed to travel with them, purportedly to discuss the deal, he was escorted to Ishikawa Prefecture. There, on a quiet Noto beach, Kim's team handed Kume over to another operative who was waiting with a boat. Under cover of darkness, Kume was taken across the Sea of Japan by boat, bound for North Korea. It was effectively a state-sponsored kidnapping, an ordinary Japanese citizen snatched from home shores and spirited away to a foreign land. The motive behind such abductions later became somewhat clearer. During the 1970s and 1980s, North Korea carried out a secret program to abduct foreigners for various purposes. Japanese nationals were targeted to steal their identities and to train North Korean spies in Japanese language and culture. In several cases, abductees were forced to teach Japanese language classes to North Korean agents, helping them learn how to pass as Japanese abroad. In other more sinister cases, women were forcibly married to North Korean officials and instructed to raise their children as the perfect infiltrators of Japanese society. These children were raised speaking Japanese natively and had all the inherent mannerisms associated with Japanese people, rather than North Korean people. This, of course, reminds me of that famous scene in Inglourious Bastards, where a spy makes a 3 sign with his fingers in an American or British way rather than a German way. This, of course, gives him away to the Germans, despite his perfect mastery of the German language, leading to dire consequences. By having the children raised in a perfectly immersive pseudo-Japanese environment, this issue is, in essence, solved. In Kumei's situation, investigators believe he was lured under false pretenses because his abductors saw an opportunity. He was a lonely and unremarkable middle-aged man who could be taken with little public fuss. Indeed, at the time Kumei lived alone and had been out of touch with his immediate family, which might have made him an easier target. North Korea, for its part, has consistently denied any involvement in Yutaka Kumei's disappearance. In 2002, North Korean leader Kim Jong-il admitted for the first time that North Korea had abducted Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s. However, the regime insisted that Kumei never entered North Korea. Despite these denials, Japanese authorities consider the North Korean abduction theory to be the most credible explanation by far. In January 2003, based on accumulated evidence and testimony, Japanese police took the unprecedented step of obtaining an arrest warrant for Kim Si-ho. By way of reminder, he was the North Korean spy alleged to have orchestrated Kumei's kidnapping. It was the first time a direct arrest warrant was issued for a North Korean agent in an abduction case. Kim, believed to be back in North Korea, was placed on Interpol's wanted list, and Japan formally demanded his extradition. North Korea has refused to cooperate, claiming to have no knowledge of Kim's whereabouts or even his identity. As of today, Kim Si-ho remains a fugitive, and Yutaka Kumei's fate in North Korea, if he indeed was taken there, is still unknown. In October 1997, a person walking through a wooded area near the small town of Wilkson in Washington state made a grim discovery: a set of human skeletal remains. The remains were found off a rural stretch of Gale Creek Road, about 9 miles from Wilkson School and just south of the town of Buckley. In the remote, dense woods, roughly a 45-minute drive from Seattle, it was clear the body had lain hidden for some time. Detectives from the Pierce County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene, but the immediate investigation yielded few clues about who the victim was or how she had died. Authorities determined the remains belonged to a female, roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall, and likely between 20 and 50 years old. Her skeletal remains were fully clothed, and she was wearing a distinctive long-sleeve sweatshirt emblazoned with the words, Pacific Lutheran University. These personal items provided strong circumstantial evidence that the woman had ties to the local area, as Pacific Lutheran University is located in Tacoma. The authorities searched missing person reports and contacted local campuses, believing she may be a student, yet no immediate leads surfaced. It seemed as if this woman had simply vanished into the woods without anyone knowing. Forensic examiners noted a few distinctive features on the remains. The woman had suffered a number of serious injuries during her life that had healed by the time of her death. She had a previously broken right thigh bone that had healed in a way that left her right leg slightly shorter than her left, a condition that may have caused a noticeable limp. She also bore evidence of past trauma to her jaw. A fracture of the lower jaw had been treated with surgical wiring, and some of her teeth were missing or had dental work. These healed injuries were unusual markers. In theory, they could have been key to identifying her if dental records or hospital records matched someone. Despite these potentially identifying characteristics, the investigators hit a dead end. No matching dental records were found, and crucially, no missing person report appeared to correspond to this unknown woman. With no identification and no immediate evidence of what caused the woman's passing, the case grew cold. There were no obvious signs of acute trauma, and without a name or background, investigators couldn't say whether she died from an accident, exposure, or foul play. Still, the circumstances, a relatively young woman found deceased in the woods, were suspicious enough that detectives treated the case with concern. Over the years, officials made periodic efforts to identify the Jane Doe. In 2009, more than a decade after the body was found, her details were entered into the NamUs database. This database is a nationwide repository meant to match unidentified remains with missing persons cases. The entry included her physical description, DNA profile, dental information, and descriptions of her clothing and healed injuries. An artistic forensic reconstruction of her face was also created in hopes that someone might recognize her. By the 2020s, advances in forensic science offered new hope for long unsolved cases like this one. In late 2023, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office decided to take a fresh approach to their Jane Doe case using cutting-edge DNA technology. They submitted preserved biological evidence from the 1997 remains to Othram. As you may be aware, Othram is known for its work in forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that goes beyond standard DNA profiling by constructing a person's genetic family tree. The goal was ambitious. If they could build a detailed DNA profile of the unknown woman, they might link her to relatives and finally discover her name. Othram's scientists were able to extract a viable DNA sample from the decades-old remains and perform what they call forensic-grade genome sequencing. This process decoded a comprehensive map of the woman's genetic markers. It was a painstaking process involving months of genealogical research and cooperation from family members who were likely surprised to learn of a long-lost relative. Finally, in early April 2025, the decades-old mystery was solved. The once anonymous victim was conclusively identified as Lori Craig, born December 17, 1959. After 27 years of anonymity, Pierce County's Jane Doe had her name back. When authorities announced Lori Craig's name in April 2025, they also began to piece together the story of her life and the circumstances of her disappearance. Lori was in her mid-30s at the time she went missing in the mid-1990s. She was a local resident of Pierce County, Washington, but surprisingly little is known about her personal life. At the time of her disappearance, Lori was married to a man named Ronald Martin, who was a few years her senior. According to official records, Lori was last confirmed alive in January 1996. Sometime after that point, she vanished. Strikingly, as law enforcement later noted, no one filed a missing person report when Lori went missing, not her husband, nor any immediate family. This fact has raised extreme suspicion amongst investigators and amongst online true crime communities. Whatever the reason, the lack of a missing persons report meant Lori's name was never entered into databases back in 1996. Thus, no one connected her to the Jane Doe found in 1997. Identifying Lori Craig was a huge step forward, but it was only the beginning of a new chapter in this cold case. With her identity known, the Pierce County Sheriff's Office announced that they were officially investigating Lori's death as an intentional slaying. Now that the case has turned into a different kind of investigation, detectives are retracing Lori's footsteps in the mid-1990s. They're trying to construct a timeline of her life leading up to her disappearance in January 1996. In particular, investigators are looking closely at the people in Lori's life at that time. Foremost among them, her late husband, Ronald Martin. Notably, Ronald Martin died in 2020 of natural causes, meaning he's of course not around to answer questions or shed light on what happened to Lori. Police have not publicly named him or anyone else as a suspect, and they emphasize that they have not determined who is responsible yet. However, it has not gone unnoticed that the one person who would have been expected to report Lori missing, her spouse, never did so. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick shout out to all my supporters on Patreon and through YouTube memberships. Also, after you're done here, check out my other channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime. These channels revolve around historical content and solve true crime cases respectively. On July 2nd, 2011, witnesses on Montreal's Jacques Cartier Bridge saw a young man with striking bright red hair climb over the railing and plunge into the St. Lawrence River. The bridge, busy with summer traffic, briefly became the scene of a desperate emergency. Police and fire crews were alerted immediately, but no rescue was possible once the man disappeared into the waters far below. For days, authorities searched the river without success. Finally, on July 7th, 2011, a body matching the description of the jumper was discovered on the river's banks. It was the same red-haired man who had been observed going off the bridge just days earlier. With no identification found on him and no immediate clues to his name, he became known only as the Montreal John Doe of 2011. The victim was a white male estimated to be in his late 20s. He stood around 5'10" and weighed about 160 pounds. Notably, he had distinctive shoulder-length, bright orange-red hair, a pale complexion, and brown eyes. Investigators observed a scar on his right wrist, but no tattoos or other unique marks. The Jacques Cartier Bridge, an imposing steel structure connecting the city to its south shore, has long been infamous as a spot for that activity. Since it opened in the 1930s, hundreds of people have, in their lowest moments, made life-ending decisions at this location. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that over 700 individuals had perished at this bridge, putting it only behind the Golden Gate Bridge in terms of deadliest bridges for this activity. For decades, this led to a grim reality. Approximately 10 people a year perished intentionally in the vicinity of the bridge. In 2004, in response to this disturbing toll, authorities installed a high steel prevention barrier along the pedestrian walkways. This barrier, essentially tall fencing topping the railing, was meant to deter jumpers. The Jacques Cartier Bridge, once an all-too-easy venue for an impulsive tragedy, had become significantly harder to jump from. However, the 2011 John Doe case proved that determined individuals could still find a way. Despite the barrier, this man managed to get over the railing. Montreal authorities treated the case with great urgency and care. The coroner's office conducted an autopsy to confirm the cause of death and look for any clues. The autopsy found no signs of foul play or trauma beyond injuries consistent with a fall from a great height. Investigators gathered every detail they could about the John Doe's appearance and belongings, hoping something might spark recognition. Notably, he had a thin chain bracelet on his left wrist, made of silver-colored metal, with multiple interlocking rings added to extend its length. The bracelet appeared to have a name engraved on it. The word Michel was discernible on the plate. And just for clarity here, that's the French version of the masculine name Michael, rather than the name Michel. He also had what's been described as a Lord of the Rings style ring on one of his fingers. This was a metal band resembling the One Ring from the famous fantasy novels, complete with what looked like elvish script etched into it. He also wore a green elastic band around his left bicep, for reasons which are entirely unclear. From the outset, the engraved name Michel on the bracelet stood out as the strongest potential lead. Was Michel his name? And if so, was it his first name, or perhaps a family name? While it's commonly a French first name, it's not an uncommon surname either. Standard identification procedures were undertaken. Fingerprints were taken from the body and run through databases. DNA samples were collected and stored. The Quebec coroner's office noted that all typical tests were done: digital fingerprinting, DNA profiling, checking dental records, but no matches turned up immediately. For a DNA match, officials would need a known relative's sample for comparison, which they didn't have. Authorities also scoured missing person reports, but no active missing person case in Montreal or in Quebec matched this man's description. In fact, nobody had reported him missing at all. This was a perplexing fact. A man in his late 20s vanished, yet no friends or family had alerted police. Recognizing they had reached a dead end with internal records, Montreal police turned to the public for help. On October 1st, 2011, about 3 months after the incident, an appeal ran in the Montreal Gazette and other media. The police published a blurry image taken of the man showing his face and distinctive red hair. The public appeal generated attention and some tips, but none led to a positive ID. People who saw the news contacted police with various suggestions. Perhaps he was a relative who hadn't been in touch, or a friend they lost contact with. Every lead was checked, but the mystery man's name and story remained elusive. By late 2011, with no solid leads, the John Doe was laid to rest anonymously, his remains stored in case future forensic advances or inquiries might identify him. With all that said, there's been rumors swirling around online in recent days that the Quebec coroner's office may be closing in on the identity of this unknown young man. Like with so many cases I cover, I suspect that the power of genetic genealogy will allow this case to be fully cracked once and for all, and give this man his identity back. I hope to have an update on this Montreal John Doe in a future video.